possibility that allow us to connect virtually today. And that includes the conflict minerals that go into our computers and our mind under very unethical and ecologically destructive conditions, and the carbon that is created from the data centers that allow these machines to run, and our important virtual connections to be possible. And these conditions remind us that almost everything about our daily lives in the modern colonial world is entangled in not only local, but also global colonial relations, and in the systems that are creating destruction and climate change. And the temptation to position ourselves as if we were only contributing solutions to these harmful entanglements, but I want to suggest that this is an incomplete picture, and that our efforts to enact social and ecological change are going to be ineffective and maybe even harmful if we don't see how we're also contributing to creating the problem. And rather than feeling overwhelmed or immobilized by this complicity in social and ecological harm, my invitation and the invitation of the collective that I work with, which I'll speak about in a moment, is for this sense of complicity to actually activate a sense of responsibility for what we might need to do. So let me start by introducing the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. We are a transdisciplinary, transnational, and intergenerational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and knowledge keepers. In our work together, we ask what kind of education is needed in order to address the challenges and complexities that we face at the interface of, one, questions of historical, systemic, and ongoing colonial violence, and two, the ecological unsustainability of our current habits of being. So our work brings together different kinds of questions related to racism, colonialism, climate change, economic instability, mental health crises, and various intensifications of social and ecological violence. And our approach to this work is fairly counterintuitive. And one of the biggest reasons for that is we don't approach coloniality and unsustainability as problems of ignorance that can be solved by inputting more information. For instance, more information about colonial structure and policies. Although having this information is incredibly important, we also find that intellectual interventions are generally not enough to interrupt the modern colonial habits of being and desiring and relating that keep us invested in a violent and unsustainable system and all of the shiny things that that system promises us. This is a system that requires harm by design through the very way that it's structured. But because we're invested in this system and the things it promises, we tend to deny its true costs, even if intellectually we know that those costs are there, and we might even have a really good systemic critique. So if the primary barrier to addressing unsustainability and coloniality is not a problem just of ignorance, but also of conscious and unconscious investments in colonialism and its promises, then we tend to deny its harms or disavow them. And if that's the case, we need a very different kind of education than the education we're used to, which is usually about inputting information or trying to convince people of something or having a moralizing critique about what they should do. In our approach to education, what we emphasize is the need to identify, interrupt, and we would say compost or work through and process modern colonial habits of being at intellectual, affective, and relational levels. And we suggest that we would have to shift all of these levels if we want to clear space and create a fertile soil for different political, economic, and ecological systems to actually emerge. And in addition to this work being informed by many different areas of scholarship, including decolonial and post-colonial studies, post-structuralism, and a decolonial form of psychoanalysis, our work is also deeply grounded in and informed by our long-term collaborations with Indigenous communities in Canada, Peru, and Brazil. And in this work, we don't always succeed, but we try to interrupt the usual patterns of engagement, in particular, the extractive patterns of relationship building that often tends to happen with communities, and common patterns whereby we romanticize and idealize communities and look to them to have all the answers. And instead, we really try to figure out how can we build relationships of trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, and also asking how those principles can ground all our relationships, both human and non-human. So what is it that we do as a collective? We create pedagogical, artistic, and embodied experiments that invite people to interrupt the attachments, desires, and denials that keep us invested in harmful habits of being. We offer containers and methodologies that allow people to face our complicity in harm and the complexities of the challenges that we face without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or seeking quick fixes, which are the usual modes that tend to happen once we start confronting these difficult topics. So we're trying to support people to develop the intellectual, affective, and relational capacities, as well as the stamina, the long-termedness of staying with what is difficult and uncomfortable and even painful. Because the work of confronting colonialism within and around us isn't easy work. If it feels easy, probably we're not doing something right, or maybe not going deep enough. So developing these capacities to hold what is difficult can also allow us to see that there are joyful parts of this work as well, and embracing that joy without using the joy as a means to bypass the difficulties of systemic change or bypass our responsibility to be part of that change. So we use this metaphor of composting shit. Basically the idea that there's a lot of things that we haven't processed and worked through both individually and systemically. And it's actually the denials and distractions that keep us from doing that composting. So we have to try and interrupt those denials. So in order to consider how education otherwise might be relevant for confronting wicked problems and the kind of educational process we propose, I have to first say a little bit about the wicked problems I'm talking about and how they relate to education. So wicked problems is this idea that we are facing these problems that are hyper complex, have multiple different layers to them, are interlocking, so that one wicked problem, say climate change, is related to another wicked problem, which is the question of how we have ethical migration, and how the solution for one of these problems tends to create new problems in another layer, because these things are all connected. It also involves many unknowns, so we can't plan with the certainties that we maybe like, and there's long and uncertain timescales about where these problems came from and where they might be going. So that's a basic overview of wicked problems. There's also this idea of super wicked problems. So those are wicked problems that have all the characteristics I just mentioned, but also we are facing the fact that time is running out to address these problems. They're very pressing problems. The fact that those who cause the problem are also often those who seek to provide a solution to that problem. The fact that a central authority is often missing to address that problem, or it doesn't have the support in order to address that problem, and that we irrationally discount the future. And of course, climate change is one of the biggest super wicked problems that many people are focusing on today as we face extreme weather in all parts of the world. So thinking about this wicked problem context interfaces with our current social and educational context, I want to highlight a few pieces. One is that we are facing a cacophony of different perspectives. So basically what we would say heteroglossia, right? There's information overload. People are interpreting things in many different ways, and there's no stable epistemic authority or imposed consensus. And on the one hand, we probably are happy about the fact that hegemonic ideas are being interrupted, but then we feel overwhelmed because we don't know how to process things without it, right? So making sense of the world is becoming increasingly difficult. There's also an oversaturation of unprocessed emotions as we face these wicked problems because we weren't generally educated in order to face them. So we don't necessarily have the resilience and the individual and collective capacities to process the emotions that are emerging within and around us in this context, which makes it hard to move forward. We're also facing increasing VUCA, so that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. For instance, we have many different perspectives on what might be the common good. And that word has, that idea has many different ideas, which goes back to the cacophony of perspectives that I mentioned before. There's also many different theories of change, of how we should approach social and institutional transformation. And we have more voices at the table, which again is a great thing. But then it's harder to make sense of what's happening at the table. And everyone at the table might have different ideas of how we move forward. And even within individual communities, there's going to be a heterogeneity of perspectives. And again, we don't necessarily have the capacities to navigate all of those different perspectives in a responsible way. And then finally, and this is something I'm experiencing a lot with students at my university, is that there's a lot of intergenerational resentment. Students are pointing out to the fact that we are reaching the limits of the planet, that the promises of endless prosperity are being broken. And some students describe this as like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Like they see what's happening and they're deeply concerned. It feels like no one's doing anything about it. And that creates another dissonance, in this case, between generations. So in GTDF, our analysis is that because our educational system, the modern colonial educational system, hasn't prepared us to face these conditions and these wicked challenges, we tend to revert back to a few things. One is that we start looking for things that offer us certainty, control, comfort, coddling, and convenience. We feel discomfort in facing complicity, ambiguity, paradoxes, and contradictions. We have a deep desire for ourselves or for the group that we appoint to have the moral authority to decide what is right and what we should do. We want to have autonomy about what we want to do, and we want to be the ones to arbitrate justice and common sense. So essentially, this makes us unprepared to recognize and navigate the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambivalence of our time. And when we're motivated by this desire for certainty, by the desire to have moral authority, we tend to believe education should have a few things. One, we wanted to emphasize hope in an idealized future. This tends to result in the reproduction of more and the same. And when I think about the students I was just speaking about, they are not buying it anymore. They can see that the future they're being promised is no longer possible, and they're frustrated that they keep being offered this hopeful future that they don't actually see a possibility for. Second is that it encourages people to look for simple, feel-good solutions. And as I mentioned, when it comes to wicked problems, these solutions usually don't exist. And then finally, this education is usually offered in a way that celebrates our agency and minimizes our complicity, which externalizes the problem and says that we're not part of it. We just need to be good people and address it. Overall, this approach to education allows us to bypass the difficult, complex, and self-implicating work that would be required of us in the present if we want different futures. And we get into this merry-go-round of looking for safe, simplistic, and feel-good solutions that sustain the status quo or our sense of certainty, security, and comfort, which then usually leads to tokenistic transactional engagements, especially with systemically marginalized communities that are driven by optics or by the idea that we want to look and feel good, as opposed to by actually what is needed. And then this leads to narrow and limited imagination of what is possible and desirable. And we keep going in this loop or this merry-go-round. So our question is, what would be the other educational option? How would we get out of this merry-go-round? And one of the ways we have described that possibility is by comparing the idea of mastery education and depth education. So I'll unpack this a little bit. Mastery education is generally what we receive in mainstream formal schooling. It assumes that education is something to be transferred by educators and accumulated and mastered by learners. So we're mastering skills and facts and competencies and information. That's why there's an image here of filling an empty cup. And generally, it's felt that this process of education as mastery facilitates the development of fully functional members of modern societies, making their labor and social contributions more valuable and meaningful. But particularly in the contemporary moment, we find that education for mastery is also rooted in consumption, not just consumption of things, but also consumption of knowledge, of ideas, of relationships, etc. And students are encouraged to treat education, particularly in this current moment, at least in my context, which is very learner-centered education, in a shift from being teacher-centered. Students are encouraged to treat their education as a menu of options from which they get to choose in order to feel comfortable, hopeful, inspired, and empowered. Now, education for depth offers a different invitation. And it's an invitation, it's not a prescription. Education for depth, or depth education, invites learners as well as teachers to dive into the complexities, contradictions, and complicities that characterize the modern colonial system that we have. And that's why we have the metaphor of peeling back the layers of the onion in that image here. There's always more layers to peel, right? And the idea here is that we need to look at the limits of the system we have inherited, as well as its gifts, and also confront the difficulties involved in trying to imagine and enact something different. So it's not just we see the problems with our system and we immediately move to imagining something else. Again, as I mentioned, because we have those affective desires for certainty and comfort, it's usually a much more difficult process with lots of ups and downs. That's why we have the image here also of diving into the sea. We can say that depth education is like preparing to dive into the depths of the ocean without scuba gear, but with the capacities and stamina to keep swimming. So education for depth tries to prepare learners with stamina and dispositions to be able to hold complexities, contradictions, and complicities without trying to repress or immediately resolve them. And this, again, doesn't just require intellectual work, but also affective and relational work. And by decentering the learner and the teacher, and also humanity in general, education for depth tries to disarm the ego and invite people into a space of sobriety, maturity, humility, discernment, and responsibility. So the question that depth education asks are, how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked challenges of our time? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing for each other and to the land at all times? And how can we choose this option of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability? So I've told you a lot about what depth education and what GTDF's work does, and I want to just give you an example of what that looks like so that you can experience it a little bit for yourself. And then I'm happy to take questions. So this is an educational tool called 7 Steps Back and Forward and Aside. And it tries, as I said, to be one tool in supporting people to develop the intellectual, affective, and relational capacities to actually coordinate critically engaged and contextually relevant and complexity-based responses to social and ecological problems. So there are 7 invitations for stepping back and 7 invitations for stepping forward so that we can increase our capacity to hold the weight of the multiple moving layers of complexity, complicity, and uncertainty that characterize our current times. So the first steps are the steps back. And this first one is about stepping back from our self-image and trying to decenter the ego and center the challenge at hand. The second step is about stepping back from our generational cohort. Remember, I mentioned this piece about intergenerational resentment. So how can we step back from our generational cohort in order to gain a deeper sense of how incoming generations, if we're in older generations, or how older generations, if we're in younger generations, may be interpreting and experiencing the challenges we're facing in a different way. Third is trying to step back from the universalization of our own social, cultural, and economic parameters of normality in order to see that that is not the only way of understanding the world, and to actually see that for those of us who have a lot of privilege, that privilege, as Spivak would say, is actually a loss of perspective, and seeing actually what we're missing by seeing the world through just one lens. Fourth is stepping back from the immediate context and time in which we find ourselves in order to see how the challenges we're facing in the current moment relate to wider historical, structural, and systemic patterns. So essentially looking at the present challenges in a diachronic way to see where they're coming from and where they might be headed depending on how we decide to address them. 5 is stepping back from our normalized patterns of problem posing, problem solving, and relationship building in order to tap into possibilities that are actually already viable, but are unimaginable and maybe unintelligible to us within the mainstream frames of reference that we have. So it's not just about, answering the problem differently, but looking at the problem differently and framing it in a different way. 6 is stepping back from the elevation of humanity above the rest of nature to see how we're also entangled with everything else, right? There is no away. We're all part of the pollution that we create back to us. We're not separate. And then 7 is stepping back from the impulse to find quick fixes to problems that have no quick fixes so that we can not be immobilized by complexity, complicity, and uncertainty. So these are about stepping back, trying to gain a little bit of perspective taking from other people's perspective. And then there would be the follow-up, which is 7 steps, either forward or if we want to say aside, if we want to challenge the idea of progress moving in linear ways. So the first step forward or aside would be stepping forward with honesty and courage to see the things that we don't want to see. So interrupting some of those denials of unsustainability, those denials of our complicity in colonialism, so that we can see what's really there without hiding the truth from ourselves. Second is stepping forward or aside with humility to find strength in openness and vulnerability. And that feels differently depending on our different positionalities. But seeing if there's a way to see that we don't have all the answers and we're all learning and we're all part of the problem and potentially are part of the solution as well. Third would be stepping forward and aside with self-reflexivity so that we can read how we're being read and learn to read the room, which is often very difficult, especially for people with systemic privilege who are universalizing their perspectives. They can often go into a room and not worry about how they're being read. So this is an invitation, especially for those with a lot of systemic privilege, to see, how am I being read in this space? How am I reading this space? How might others read it differently? And what are the responsibilities that follow from that? Fourth is stepping forward or aside with self-discipline. So doing the work on ourselves so that we don't create work for other people. And then stepping forward or aside with maturity to do what is needed rather than what we want to do. 6 is stepping forward or aside with expanding our discernment and attention. So as things get more complex and as the problems that we're facing become riskier, we need to do it with more care and with more attention to actually figure out the ones before it, which is what is actually needed and how that relates to what we can do. And then finally, stepping forward or aside with adaptability, flexibility, and stamina for the long haul, because the problems that we're facing now are not recent. They are the product of many centuries of systemic violence and unsustainability. So we're not going to address them immediately. We need to be prepared to do this for our whole lives and probably for many generations to come. We also need to be prepared to fall in this work, to fail, to have the plans that we had imagined shattered and remade, to have our hearts and our minds stretched, to change course as needed, and to try and find joy in the struggle itself rather than in the prize at the end. This is something we really emphasize in the collective, which is that it's not about the destination, right? It's about how we actually move together toward a different future, and the quality of our relationships and the integrity of our learning as we move will shape where we arrive. And that's a very different approach than saying, we already know where we want to go, we just need to figure out how to get there. So that is a little bit about the invitation offered by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. I do have to run soon, but I can take 1 or 2 questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sharon Stein. So now we turn to questions from the audience. So if you have some questions, you can, speak and ask the questions yourselves, because I think you are going to be promoted to as, you know, presenters. So I don't know, where are you? So Tamara, Professor Klebe, who else? We have Camila House.
We need to open the chat for the participants because maybe someone doesn't like to open the camera or speak in English. Maybe put your comments in the chat. Laís Barbosa, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Can be.
Actually, it's not a question, it's just a comment. Let me just share my screen, okay? First of all, it's a pleasure to be in this event. My name is Laís. I'm from the Federal University of the North of Tocantins, but I'm from Pará. And I live in a city, and I live and I work in a city where the main activity is an higher exploration. And I think it's the biggest one in Brazil, in Paraopebas, located in Paraopebas in the north of Pará, in the southeast of Pará. This city is also surrounded by indigenous people and marked with a flow of people from everywhere, from Minas Gerais, mainly because of this higher exploration. And since I started working there, I've been thinking about how this flow of people, how this savage exploration interferes in students' education and also in teachers' practices. So what do you think about it? So how the professor think about this kind of savage exploration, this flow of people? Because sometimes we have so many come and go of students, and we don't have a specific public, for example. We have many students that come and go all the time because their parents come to work and then they go because they go to another place. They are transferred, for example. How do you think this can interfere in a student's education, in student's life, to have integral education? Thank you. It's a pleasure to listen to you all.
Thank you, Laisi. One thing that's, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there's a couple things that come to mind. And one is just that I think that starting with the context that you're in is always a good place to start, and actually inviting students to do that inquiry with you, the context. So for instance, I teach courses about higher education and how it operates, and my students do projects about the context of my university, the University of British Columbia. So I asked them, for instance, to look at all the buildings that are named after people and ask, where did those people get the money in order to donate to the university to have a building named after them? And how does that show us how systems of capitalism and accumulation operate and how those are related to the university itself? And allowing them to kind of figure it out themselves, as opposed to kind of telling them, can be a way to get them involved, and also can show them a methodology that they could bring to wherever they go, because context is incredibly important in these conversations. But if we have sort of general tools of inquiry that they could bring when they are moving around these spaces, but there is the complexity of the fact that some students don't want to do this work. So the other thing is making it an invitation that people are welcome to do, and telling them the terms. For instance, with our work, we have many caveats at the beginning of a workshop that say, this is going to be difficult, it's going to make you uncomfortable, you need to decide whether this is the time and space to do this work. And if it's not, that's totally okay. And doing that in a formal institutional context can be a little bit tricky, especially when the courses are required or things like that. But I think starting with where you're at is actually a great place to start the inquiry. I don't know if that helps, but that's what came.
Yeah, for sure. I am finishing my first year of PhD, and I am thinking about this curriculum, how to think about the ongoing, the in-service teachers curriculum. discuss, to build together another one. So it was very nice to hear to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lacey. Good luck.
Okay, thank you, Lacey. I think we have time for one more question. Let me just check the webinar chat if we have more questions. Yeah, we have a question from, well, we have two more questions. One from Camila House. She says, Professor Sharon, thank you for your presentation. Could you please say a few words about assessment, this other perspective of education? Thinking about depth education, is assessment necessary? Or should we start thinking about different ways of following our students' processes of learning? Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question, Camila. So I wish I had more time to talk about this. But one of the things that we do in the depth education practice is that we often talk about the work we do as a means of students doing their own self-assessment. And by that, I mean, not in the traditional way, but in a way of learning to step back, as I said, so that they can observe their own learning. And in particular, they're learning in relation to the affective piece of this. So we have a metaphor that we often use called the bus metaphor, the idea that we have a bus full of people inside of us that are going to respond even to one stimulus with many different, even conflicting responses. So we present a stimulus, perhaps the list of 7 steps back and steps forward, and say, what is coming up in your bus? Observe the different passengers, how they're responding. What are they thinking, feeling, and saying? And then we might say, okay, now take one step back from that and say, what are you learning about yourself and where you're currently at with this work by observing your bus? And in that sense, it's a self-assessment of where you're at in this work. And what we say is, we are not trying to control what you think. What we're interested in is the depth of your learning process. And using the bus is one way that we are trying to do it. And actually, with the rise of ChatGPT and AI, we need these different kinds of assessment that can't be done through an AI, right? This kind of self-assessment would show us something that they wouldn't really be able to find anywhere else except by looking inward. So yes, we need different ways, but what that looks like, again, in a formal educational context is very much evolving.
Well, thank you, Professor Sharon. I think we have one more question. Is it possible to do that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
For Juliani,
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, this is from Julianis, and she says, hello, Sharon. It's so good to see you here. Thank you for sharing your reflections and practices with us. I'd like to hear from you how those collective conversations are being heard and accepted or not inside your own professional context, and how the affective and relational work has transformed the way you navigate academia.
Great question, Juliani, as always. I wish we had more time. It depends. As we see the proliferation of sort of these social and ecological challenges, we see also a proliferation of responses to our work. There are more and more people looking for a different kind of education. That I know for sure. Not everyone who's looking for a different kind of education is looking for the kind of education we offer. But what we usually find is that when we're presenting this, there's like the majority of the people, they don't have much response. Some people then respond really negatively, especially those people are generally people that feel that the diagnosis that we're offering about the problem is like as if we were causing it. By naming the problem, we become the problem. Then there's the small majority on the other side who have been totally frustrated by all the available options, and therefore they're willing to try anything. And they're like, this is it. This is what I was looking for. Sometimes they're not actually looking for it, and that becomes a process of figuring that out, which is, again, always why we make it an invitation. We don't make it a prescription. But I think more and more students are looking for something else, but they're often torn between looking for something else and like in their soul really wanting something else, and then also the modern colonial desires that they also have. So the same students that say this is a train wreck are the students who also say I still want a Gucci bag. So we're trying to they're navigating those different desires as well, and all we can do is try and support them through that and hope that through this process they end up making the most sober, mature, and responsible decisions that they can. So to be continued, this conversation, Giuliani.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for your thoughts. It's always great to have this sharing with you about the decolonial perspective on, language learning and internationalization and so on. So thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I hope the conversation goes well.
So now we pass the turn to Professor Adriana Gonzalez Moncada. And Professor Adriana is, let me just get her bio here. Professor Adriana Gonzalez holds a doctoral degree in linguistics from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and a Master of Arts in Language Sciences from the Université de Nancy II in France, and a B.Ed. English Spanish from Universidad de Antioquia. She's a professor at the School of Language at Universidad de Antioquia. Her professorship activities include teaching courses in the B.Ed. in Foreign Language Teacher Education, the Masters in Foreign Language Teaching and Learning, and the Doctorate in Education. Well, she has a long bio, and I invite the audience to check her bio, her, CV. And now she's going to talk about international experiences in English teacher education, another colonial strategy. So, wow, that's a very interesting question. Welcome. The floor is yours, Professor Adriana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone. Bom dia. Estou muito honrada por estar aqui. I am very sorry. I spent 2 weeks in Brazil, the last 2 weeks, and I was in love again with the country and the fantastic people I met in person and fantastic people I have connected to. But I am terribly handicapped my limited proficiency in Portuguese. It's a promise to speak and learn Portuguese, a fantastic language, and that makes me very, very happy to be here. I want to thank the organizing committee, of course, Kleber, Juliana, Lauro, Tamara, everyone who's behind this, as I belong to this Global South collective that Kleber coordinates, and I am always honored and thankful to the Brazilian colleagues, students, teachers, teacher educators, researchers, and everyone who has definitely raised awareness on many issues in my professional and personal life. So if you allow me, I will share my screen so that I can begin with my presentation. So as you read here in this title, I am trying to raise questions, and one specific question about English language teacher education based on the experiences that I have had. And I will, of course, show my loci of enunciation later. But this is more a question than an answer. And after having Sharon's wonderful presentation, it connects in many ways. And I think it was a very good opportunity to frame what I'm going to talk about. So I'm asking if the internationalization of English language teacher education is just another strategy for coloniality, and probably the answer is yes. But let's see how you may also, if you find coincidences with the Brazilian perspective. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to, okay, my timer, because It's 25 minutes. Okay, so in this, this is the agenda that I propose. I'm going to have a brief introduction as you see. I'm going to talk about the internationalization of education in Colombia, the internationalization of English teacher education, and how this has been an expression of coloniality through the different experiences that we have lived through in Colombia, more specifically after the national language education policy called the National Program of Bilingualism that reduces bilingualism to English and Spanish in our country. So despite of being a multilingual, multicultural nation where we have 68 indigenous languages, 2 Creoles, Colombian Sign Language, and Romani language. So this policy has reduced bilingualism to English and Spanish. And I will have some final remarks just to possibilities for contesting these coloniality practices in English teacher education. So where am I standing and who am I? So my loci of enunciation, this is important for you to see who I am, because everything that I am reflecting on and what I'm saying comes from my, of course, my personal and my academic and professional experience. And this is the person who is talking to you today. So Adriana Gonzalez, and in Brazil, Adriana Moncada. So this is the person that is has had a trajectory because, of course, it responds to my personal and professional, as I mentioned, life. I am a Colombian female heterosexual, middle-aged, middle-class. I'm a professor, a full professor in a public research university that has a critical stance and where everyone's work has been respected, and we have been very critical of all political, educational, economic, social, cultural practices, laws, and legislations that the country and the government has promoted. So I am very privileged to talk and to be able to have a voice while other colleagues that are younger or have a non-permanent, non-tenured contract or are part-timers need to respond to different pressures. There are other Colombian professors and scholars that work in private universities where they do not have the opportunity to express their feelings and share their possible contradictions to the national and international policies as they may be covered by restrictions from the places where they work. So I'm a multilingual speaker and I have been lucky to travel to different places. I have a long career in teaching, research, and publications. And I have been member and I am member of international networks. And as I said, so honored to be part of the Global South Collective. I have had experience in international academic events, and I had the opportunity to be the director of the Office of International Affairs in my university, which is the second largest university in Colombia. And I have this position for 4 years. So when I'm talking to you, I'm trying to share is this group of experiences that come from being an administrator, a supervisor, a practicum supervisor, a dean, a teacher educator, and of course, a colleague. So in the case of Colombia, and I have the references to the policy and the main publications, so we have seen international agreements as a possibility for development. And this is basically the promotion of experts and training people and support people, but mainly business people searching for international markets. So this has been, if Colombia wants to be international, if Colombia wants to be connected to the world, is basically because the governments for a long time have decided to increase the gross domestic product through modern services. So changing our tradition of an agricultural country, as you say, exporting coffee or exploiting natural resources such as oil and coal, for example. So trying to connect to a new modern world where international networking means improving the economy in the country and, of course, trade competitiveness. And unfortunately, as the National Planning Direction talks about this, so the 2022-2026 development plan is talking about internationalization as business. As you may see, it's a long-term strategy that has begun decades ago, but it's looking at Colombia as a possibility for investment and how we can attract tourists and investors. So this is the major government idea. And of course, as you may see, part of this internationalization is tightly related to education in the attempts to make the country bilingual, which means, ironically, as I said, reducing our multilingualism to the mastery of English. So different international agencies have insisted on the need of the country to speak English. So if Colombian citizens speak English, as I have said in various opportunities, so there's this idea that they will be famous, rich, successful, and we will have all the possibilities of, you know, a developed country, because as we have been labeled as underdeveloped, one of the major causes for this, for our poverty and for our lack of opportunities and our lack of competitiveness in the world, is not being able to speak English. And of course, it also comes with another very important access in our development plan, which is access and use of ICTs. So in this case, bilingualism, English mastery, and access and use of ICTs, it's supposed to be the key to these opportunity that will close the gap inside the country between the rich and the poor, and of course, making us internationally competitive. Oh, sorry, just one here. Okay, so as part of this internationalization idea, education plays a key, very key role. And as I have said, our major concern is making Colombian citizens competent for the labor market and meeting globalization standards. As we became members of the OECD, so our governments made this compromise to make Colombian citizens bilingual. And this means insisting that English should go through the whole educational system, from K through higher education, and English is probably one of the most consistent requirements for graduation, which is of course questionable, because in many cases we need to see if English is pertinent, if English is needed, and if English really supports personal, economic, social, and cultural development. English is also a key as internationalization of education to consolidate all the peace efforts that the governments have tried. After decades of domestic conflict and the problems with paramilitary, with guerrilla, with all different armed groups, so we have been trying to have a peaceful country where, of course, education is the key, but the governments have insisted on internationalization of education, coming with different currents and different ideas from globalized, standardized practices that usually come from the global north. And as we see, education is supposed to be part of these agendas for science and technology, in which we're seen as consumers of science technology and not as real knowledge producers. And in the newest government's ideas, there's a slight change, thinking about the production of local knowledge that could be pertinent internationally, or that could be applicable in other contexts in the world. But again, the major component is bilingualism and proficient use of ICTs. So now in higher education, so we go from internationalization of education, and internationalization of higher education. So of course, this has been unfortunately reduced to very specific practices that include only mobility, dual degrees, joint research projects, networking, mutual recognition of quality assurance and accreditation systems, And this has been negotiated as multilateral and bilateral agreements have forced the country to sign, as we need to be competitive in this global market. There is not much space in these policies for human growth. What about the development of the conditions of the regions, the conditions of the different peoples that we have, the diversity of customs, the diversity of practices, the diversity of languages. So this is, as we see, unfortunately, internationalization of higher education follows the path of serving the economic development of the country. As I just have mentioned, so we go again, and this is a summary of I have said, and this is very important, as it is seen that internationalization means adopting international standardized practices for making the programs compatible, or making the negotiations and acceptance of degrees or acceptance of training valid in the country. And this major option has moved the government to propose that universities in Colombia adopt these practices, these standardized, globalized, transparent technical practices in higher education to get more foreign students coming to Colombia, so that the universities either attract people who come in person, or through different practices of online education, we can export our practices, and we can have the opportunity to export our degrees and attract different students and researchers and professors through also the online market. In the case, as we see here, so there is a possibility. So instead of responding to this economic agenda that is imposed, and it's making us think about the possibilities for becoming international and accepted in this globalized world, so we need to find possibilities for multiple ways. So there's not one single way that is imposing one agenda. And of course, what we need to see is that internationalization is an opportunity for looking at different ways. So how other people do things, how other people educate their citizens, their professors, their professionals, how they educate their children, so that we can see that basically we share the common problems, as Sharon mentioned, for example. If we all share more problems than we think, so why, instead of having one single standardized solution, we see internationalization as a possibility for increasing, as it says, you know, looking at how education has responded to very local practices and local context. But on the other hand, oh, I'm sorry, this is, I just got this, I'm sorry. But on the other hand, it offers possibilities for comparing, contrasting, and meeting new possibilities together through collegial work. So now, in the case of how has English teacher education been, how has this been an international approach in Colombia? And of course, to talk about this, I have to refer to the Bilingual Colombia, or the National Bilingualism Plan that started in 2004, and it's supposed to finish in 2025. So we have had the leading role of foreign advisory agencies. The main of them has been the British Council, and the British Council has participated in the design, implementation, evaluation, and of course, it is still there almost 20 years ago. And through the leading role of their experts, so they have contributed to the discussion of the language acquisition and the teaching component in English teacher education. Of course, they have come with their exams, training materials, textbooks, and they have also come with the promotion of alternative teaching certifications. So as the English teaching market has increased tremendously in Colombia. So the British Council and other international agencies have come and have, of course, promoted international certifications, as I will mention later, that replace teacher education. And in some cases, they are required besides having an English language teaching education degree. So they become part of this globalized market and an endorsement to the quality of local universities. Of course, this has also had something, this has had something that I have criticized and mentioned, and I have highlighted for many years, which is the promotion of native speakerism. Most of this internationalization of English language teaching and English language teacher education responds to the deficiency model in ELT. As from the very beginning of the policy, the point of departure has been that English teachers that are Colombian, local teachers, do not speak the language and do not have the proper methodologies to teach the language. So under that deficiency model, it is important for the foreign agencies to come and, of course, to instruct us, and not only to shape teachers' professional development, but also to have a word in language teacher education. We have the B2 C1 level as the target for teachers. For teachers who are already in the profession is the B2 level of the Common European Framework, but for new graduates is the C1 level. And as I mentioned before, so we have those additional and alternative teaching certifications, such as the ISILT, the Delta, the CELTA, oh, I repeated that, I am sorry about that, the Delta, the CELTA, and the TKT, the Teaching Knowledge Test. That has had a very powerful action and has shaped how teacher education programs connect to other institutions in the world. So there's always this search for a foreign native speaker that comes as an instructor, or having contact with native speakers in different parts of the world, basically in the inner circle countries, because those foreign speakers and those foreign experts and those people that have come to be part of the national policy in English teaching come to correct the teachers' professional flaws. As I mentioned before, the basic premise is that local teachers do not speak the language well. They do not know how to teach the language properly so that students achieve the development required in their proficiency. And of course, this is tightly connected to the university's responsibility. So under the government's eyes, teacher education programs and teacher educators and researchers were, of course, responsible of all this that is happening. And all this has increased the lack of social respect and trust in local English teachers. So these sort of discourses that have been repeatedly and promoted through different social media, the press, that teachers are not good enough to face the challenges of the national education policy, and of course, what is needed for Colombians in the globalized world. So what has been done? So these are part of the colonial and these coloniality discourses and practices that have influenced teacher education. And some universities have responded in various manners. As I said at the beginning, so public universities have had more room for action and counter discourses, contesting, reacting, and adapting, and of course, embracing the policies in a different way. So this policy appropriation has taken various forms and different degrees of compromise to the national policy, or contesting, or just resisting the policy, which is complicated. And as Sharon said, there are more questions than answers, and you know, we're now even trying to figure out what the problems are and what the challenges are. One of those major strategies, and I mentioned this TKT, Teaching Knowledge Test, as these additional and certification, an alternative certification for English language teaching, was trying to accommodate the national teacher education curricula and the specific national teacher education curricula to the TKT. So these almost 8 years ago, the government tried to align all the curricula and the components, the pedagogical components, language acquisition component, and research component of our programs to the TKT, so that when students graduated, they could have the TKT certification. So besides obtaining the degree, they could be internationally certified, trying to have this as an additional proof of the quality in the teacher education programs. For various reasons, people reacted, and some universities adopted this, others didn't. But after so much political and academic debate, so these finished. But what we have seen and has not stopped is the promotion of English varieties, especially American English and British English, coming from the inner circle. And of course, there's a very serious, sorry about this, a serious, I'm moving to the wrong way, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm promoting, of course, inner circle authors and research and epistemologies as part of the major references and the major frameworks, theoretical frameworks for our teacher education programs. The country favors academic exchanges that have partnerships with the global north. And this is seen, of course, as a very good sign of qualities. When we look at these coloniality practices and discourses and the theories for English language acquisition, so we see that the government has favored in these international perspectives, focusing on cognitive approaches that see language acquisition as an individual process. So there's lack of looking at languages as an instrument of social interaction and, of course, existence and coexistence within the different settings where we operate. And language seems to be still seen as a structuralist or from a structuralist viewpoint. There are very few references to cognitivism, and there are other ways to look at, for example, Vygotsky's theories, but there, in practice, many of the programs have still responded to these language acquisition, all the language acquisition parameter. And the native or native-like language proficiency is, of course, the target. We see that in this internationalization of teacher education, language teacher education programs, the standardized tests have a major role. So at the end of our programs, teachers and future teachers are supposed to take these exams, and based on the scores of these exams, the language education program is seen as quality, as it responds to the quality standards or not. So in regards to how these international views of English language teaching see theories of English language teaching in itself, they favor communicative approaches that see Spanish, in our case, as a suspicious component of the language acquisition. So there's still these ideas that, you know, the first language corrupts the second language, and issues such as translanguaging, for example, are taking a very slow step in the minds of teacher educators, and in the majority of cases, it's teacher education programs try to create these isolated space where English only is spoken, and it's supposed to increase and improve the proficiency in future teachers. There's, and these, the methodologies that promote communication and tend to meet the international standards and come with different experts that share with us what is working in different global north settings mainly. And this is prestigious, and this comes as part of the more frequent exchanges that we have with foreign universities. And although there's space for some critical action, the critical action has been usually reduced to the classroom and the school. So the programs think about the possibilities of being critical and have advocacy, but there's very little room for social and broader national and international political action. In regards to the principles of second language acquisition, which is something that we need to extend to teacher education, for example. So it would be very important if we could definitely look at principles of particularity in which goes into how the way English is taught and how English is learned, but also how we educate the teachers. And of course, this is also important to look at the possibilities that we need to embrace as Atkinson says, and the Douglas Fair Group, for example, we need to have an emphasis on holism, integrativeness, and relationality, because we know that the language is only one aspect in our lives, and there are ecological, by nature, languages needs to be taken as from an ecological perspective, and we need to see human, and it's an expression of human existence and an activity. So how could we, of course, as Siever and Mantel say, so even if these international discourses try to shape the way teachers are education, we know for sure that those practices cannot be transferred or uncontested. So it's here where we have these important gap, where we have this possibility, where there's a crack for, of course, as I will mention, there is a crack, especially because universities are autonomous and universities have the capacity to react through freedom of speech and, of course, freedom of teaching. As we know, international teacher education movements or the internationalization of teacher education, and especially English language teacher education, we need to use those cracks, those gaps for action. And of course, we need to connect this to the more global challenges of the profession, because the more we know about other teachers and other teacher education programs, the more we know that we have in common. And yet there should be some balance between what is international, what is global, what is human, but also how we respond to local teaching professional practices. So those are the final remarks. How can we contest these colonial discourses and practices? We need to insist on the possibility of academic and political actions that raise awareness beyond the economic benefits of internationalization. So we need to tell politicians, and we need to educate them, and we need to educate policymakers and people at different places in the ministries of education. Sometimes we need to educate our rectors, and we need to educate our people in charge of decisions and advocating for these critical intercultural perspectives in language education and teacher education. We need to convince them that being a multilingual person, being a person with an international perspective, does not respond exclusively to economic benefits. And of course, we need to embrace social cognitive approaches in second language acquisition and teacher education. Because yes, as critical as we are, so we know that language acquisition and education and learning has a cognitive part. So there is cognition, but cognition in itself doesn't work. Cognition and good cognition to embrace and to learn what is needed to be learned, and what we need to acquire in terms of skills, knowledges, competences, etc., of course, is located in a human being that has a different space, a different history, and may have different types of opportunities. We need to include more South epistemologies, authors, practices, and as a possibility for internationalization, rather than looking at the global North as the target, we need to see South-South exchanges for networking and this internationalization. And finally, well, what could we do? So we need to, as we need to do it all the time. We need to challenge native speakerism and the inner circle English varieties. Because if we embrace possibilities such as English as a lingua franca or world English as an international language, we have possibilities of using English with other English speakers who are as valid targets and as valid models as the native speakers of the language. So challenging this is not easy, but it's one of the best options that we could do. Learning English and learning other languages is, of course, an opportunity for an imagined identity and belonging to an imagined community. But this requires of the critical participation, the political action, and the search for social justice, as I say later. And we need to become actively involved in and going beyond the school and going beyond the classroom and beyond the university to connect to other critical thinkers that we have all over the world. As Kumara Vadivelu has mentioned for many, many years, so we need to embrace that post-method approaches and of course, all the ecological perspectives that claim the place for construction of localized practices that respond to the needs of students and teachers. And finally, I think this, even if internationalization is important and we need to look at ways to connect to the world beyond economy and the benefits for globalization, it's important that we keep in mind that we need to fight all the time for respect and trust in teachers and teacher educators. And as I say, and I have said this various times, it is important in these practices to challenge coloniality, strategies, practices, discourses in internationalization of English teacher education. We need to insist, persist, resist, and never desist. Insistir, resistir, persistir, y nunca desistir. Thank you very much. Gracias. Obrigada. This is my email in case you are interested in contacting me later or if you want to have a copy of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Wow, what an important presentation and talk, Professor Adriana. Your research connects to my research from the doctorate. I'm going to finish this year, and I'm very happy to hear from you about this internationalization of English teachers education and how to decolonialize this understanding of why, how, from what means to do that. And I think the audience might have some questions before we can talk a little bit, but I have just a comment from Julianne Silva. She says, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Adriana. I think that we Brazilian language teachers and teacher educators share many of the problems, demands, and concerns you have shared with us during your talk. It is good to know that we are not alone and that we can join forces to challenge language coloniality and all types of coloniality that constitute and inform our practices and lives. Nobody has asked a question, and I don't know if they want to open their cameras and ask directly to you, but I have a question for you, or just a comment about the tests, about the exam, the proficiency tests. We all know that many English teachers in Brazil, for example, when we have a continuing education program for English teachers in Brazil, we have two of them. Personally, I work specifically I work at the Federal Network of Vocational Education in Brazil. And in 2015, there was a program which was implemented in 2016 and 2017 called CETEC Caps Nova, CETEC-NOVA. It's from the Northern Virginia Community College. And this was offered for English teachers from the Federal Network in Brazil. And many teachers didn't pass the exam or didn't get the score necessary to invest in the process. But many of them, mainly the ones who don't get the score necessary to invest in that continuing education program, they don't get the score. So the teachers who get the score are the ones that maybe have already had the opportunity to English courses, to traveling abroad, intercultural experiences. So I totally agree with you that when in your talk you say that there is a kind of, apparatus or status quo to keep this thing not working. And it's like, at the same time, the governmental institutions, the international organisms say that, wow, education must be done like this. We need to think about internationalization, interculturality, and so on. Education as a tool for developing the world. At the same time, these same organisms and these institutional organizations, they don't offer real opportunities for the teachers to, develop education in a really developing way to changing realities. So I would like to talk to you about the tests, the proficiency test. How could we, contest or, create seizures and, how to act in another agenda in order to try to change this in a local, perspective. We know how to do this. We have so many ways to create these, seizures and, but I would like to hear from you. What have you been doing in your institution in order to, include teachers who don't get the scores necessary to participate in these internationalization educational programs?
That's not an easy question, Laura.
Yeah.
But before I try to say my little couple of words, I really appreciate the comment Juliana made. And in the fantastic event I attended at Universidade de São Paulo last week, I was thrilled as I had the honor to give a plenary and I talked about the Colombian situation. And I had the opportunity to listen people in the audience talking about Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Mexico. So it's the same situation. And of course, some people said, oh, it's exactly the same in Brazil. And in the fantastic concurrent sessions that some Brazilian and international students and graduate students and professors conducted, I saw that this is a very common problem. So it seems to be all over the world. So lack of respect and trust in teachers. And if I reduce it to English teachers, the responsibility on teachers' shoulders, the burden, because the language policies to make the countries bilingual are not working. So it is easy to say, so is the teacher's responsibility and is the teacher educator's responsibility. So trying to connect and align all the teacher education curricula to international standardized prestigious programs, it seems to be the norm. So, and we know experiences in many countries in Latin America and in Asia, for example. But the issue of teachers' language proficiency is a never-ending situation, because the major problem is that we respond to the global North educational an academic market. So powerful agencies, at least in Colombia, the British Council has tremendous power, and they have those tentacles that have, of course, they come to tell us how to learn the language, how to teach the language, how to educate the teachers. And the proficiency exams are a key component of the market. And they sell the exams, they sell the preparation for the exams, they sell the textbooks for the exams, and they have all these idea that this test is necessary to succeed. And in response to that, because the tests come to the targets and this idealization of the native speaker as the norm, it is not easy to contest that. At least in our teacher education program, what we have done is to try as much as possible to omit the language proficiency requirement for professional development opportunities, because the problem is very serious. There is not one single type of language teacher. There is not one single type of teacher that has a B1 level or A1 or B2 or C1. We have a multiplicity of teachers, and we have teachers who do not teach the language because they don't speak the language, because they were not trained to be English teachers. The language imposition requires everyone to speak the language, even if they didn't have, and they don't, and if they didn't have training in that. So this issue is controversial, and what we have tried to do, and I know a group of universities led by our School of Languages is trying to create a local national English proficiency test. So we're trying to create alternatives, and that universities accept our local test as a proficiency measure. And of course, this requires lots of thinking and a different perspective. If we, as Lourdes Ortega says, for second language acquisition, if we move the target of the native speaker, this ideal native speaker, if we move the target to a competent multilingual speaker, things change. Multilingual speakers do not have perfect mastery of the language. Multilingual speakers use different repertoires. Multilingual speakers use translanguaging, and they support the language knowledge they have. And of course, the first language is important. So little steps take a lot of political action, and we need to convince university authorities, because we cannot deny, this is a multi-million-dollar business. And if instead of paying $250 for the TOEFL exam or the, I don't know, the IELTS or whatever exam or certification, we have a local test, everyone is going to question the validity of the test. But those are little steps. And as Sharon says, we have now new questions. We don't have a lot of answers, and we're trying to figure out what the problem is. And in teacher education, especially with the call for internationalization, this is not an easy endeavor. I'm sorry, did I answer? That I got excited.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm very happy to hear that from you. And I'm very curious about this local national proficiency test. I think Brazil has a lot to learn with Colombia. I didn't know about that, but I will try to read more about these, because we know that in Brazil, TOEFL has a strong imposition, and it's becoming more and more expensive. And maybe in another opportunity, I would like to talk to you about how, what did you do to make the institutions to recognize this local national proficiency test, because sometimes it's like an imposition from the institutions, from the host institution. We only recognize TOEFL and IELTS, for example, and we don't recognize these tests. So it's also working on the demands of, relations, institutional relations, from Brazilian institutions and the host institutions abroad. And I really appreciate Colombia initiative. Thank you. Well, I don't know if
Thank you.
anybody else. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has questions. People from the audience. We have 27 people here.
I just got a message from Professor Valkyria Montemora, and she says that she would like to talk, but she's not allowed.
Wow, I
So,
really would like to hear from her.
but maybe we have no time. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Julio, could we, allow Professor Valkyria Montemor?
Valkyria, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you. So, Adriana, I loved your presentation. I think that, yes, you really focus on very, very similar situations to what we face in Brazil, and in the way that you interpret, all the scenario is very similar here, right? Yeah, I like when I think it's much more a comment than a question. I like when you emphasize the necessity of making all participants of this project of internationalization to be aware of all the gear and all the everything that is implicit in this project of internationalization, right? So this is the reason why I sent you a message saying that I loved when you mentioned a multi-million dollar project, okay, or that people should think about, right? So I'm really glad to have partnership in ideas, okay, with all of you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that you stayed. And of course, it's time to finish probably. There are other sessions, but thank you so much.
I think we have to finish. I don't know. Kleber, Julio, I think we have to finish.
Yes, Laura, unfortunately. I'd like to spend all day long, to listen Adriana, because the position that Adriana defended is pretty much the same. But okay, Valkyria, with the position, the psychological position that you have, like a group here. It's wonderful. It's amazing. I enjoy it with Adriana Moncada lecture.
Also,
it's not Adriana Gonzalez. It's not Adriana Gonzalez Moncada. It is Adriana Maria Gonzalez Moncada.
Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this panel. We really appreciate it. It was fantastic, and I think we all have learned a lot with the two panelists, Professor Sharon Stein and Professor Adriana Gonzalez. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao,
Muito
ciao.
obrigada.
Ciao.